Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on Episode 6 of The Familiar Zero. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. So last we left off, that Phantom Thief 4K stole the Staff of Destruction, and in so doing, has created something of a diplomatic incident. You see, the Princess Henrietta was visiting at the same time, nominally to visit the school, but also to visit her friend Louise, and in so doing, unfortunately, a security detail was diverted from the reliquary to the princess. You know, we know some people kind of want to pin this on the princess, but who they are and what station they hold kind of remains to be seen. The only thing that, really matters about all this is that, it seems as though the monarchy is in a pretty tenuous position as far as this country goes. And perhaps the worst part of all of it is that Louise, as Henrietta's friend, is somewhat responsible, or at least feels that way. Now, fortunately, it seems like the school's not taking things lying down. The headmaster is at least bringing some of the competent people into the fold here to handle this. Now, normally during the opening theme, I would sit quietly with reverence, but today I am obligated to my sponsor. Today's sponsor is none other than myself. You may not know this, but I write light novels, and I've written quite a few. Today, I'm going to tell you about the eccentric detective Yamamoto, in which the intrepid, if drunken, detective solves a wide variety of cases with the help of her assistant Satoshi. Ranging from finding missing pets and surveilling cheating spouses to catching a high-end cat burglar and preventing the murder of a local business magnate, no case is too big or too small for Detective Yamamoto. Even when she's forced to work with, and occasionally against, the police, and even when she must contend with her fear of the supernatural, nothing will prevent the eccentric detective from doing what needs to be done to solve the case. If this sounds like something you'd like to read, then by all means, consider purchasing books in the Eccentric Detective Yamamoto series by me, Frederick Fitzgerald, through Amazon. Thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the episode. So I find it interesting that Tabitha and Louise were called up, although I guess now we see Kirsch was summoned as well. When you get down to it, Kirsch and Tabitha, as we understand it, are competent wizards. Louise seems to be the outlier, but I guess with her relationship to the princess, and I suppose the fact that she has a familiar like Saito, she would be involved as well. It seems like kind of an odd thing that students are being brought into this, especially students like Louise, who, as we're given to understand, they're not senior-most students, they're second years, I believe. Although, I guess in retrospect, these students in particular did have an eyewitness account. I guess that makes more sense. I was jumping to conclusions, They're dispatching knights after the thief, but in the meantime they wanted to hear what's what from Louise and the others. Oh, well, maybe I spoke too soon about speaking too soon. The headmaster wants to know who will volunteer to help retrieve the staff, and no one's doing it, which, that reflects poorly on the aristocracy. Especially telling, given that Louise is the first to volunteer, because not only is she perhaps the least competent, but, she's got the most to prove on top of that. Fortunately, this has fostered a, beneficial sense of competition, with, Kirsch deciding that she must act now too, lest she lose to a Valier. It's not exactly out of friendship that everyone else is volunteering here, but somewhat heartening nonetheless, especially seeing as how none of the professors so much as lifted a finger, really. Now that's something. Tabitha's actually been knighted, too. It's interesting that we're learning that now. I mean, I guess that was something I just sort of knew. Ooh, I've got a bad feeling about this. The headmaster's describing all the various strong points of the students here and how, Tabitha's a knight, Kirsch comes from a family known for potent magic, and so does Louise, even if she doesn't have any skills of her own, She has a bright future ahead of her, so says the headmaster, but, man... in a weird sort of way, this has only really served to just sort of undermine Louise. Now, interestingly, Colbert there, he almost let something slip. The idea that Saito is in any way legendary is kind of, remarkable, but I guess in a way it does kind of make sense. Now, interestingly, Miss Longville has decided to accompany the students. I find that to be a particularly bizarre choice, given that she is a secretary or an assistant. She might have some magic competency, but that's not her real domain of expertise, I guess in particular, I'm surprised that Mr. Colbert wasn't doing anything. He seems to be more in the know than most, so surely it would behoove him to help out, but I guess not. So Miss Longville, she's letting some information slip here about how some people were aristocrats and then have lost their titles, and many of them sort of resort to mercenary work or petty crime. And I don't know. It seems like she's kind of given up the game to me. It's like, hey, yeah, we're chasing a thief, and not to put too fine a point on it, but people who lose their aristocratic titles, like me, often turn to crime. I suppose in a way it's sort of fortunate that everyone's just taking that at face value. They're more interested in how she lost her title, lest the same fate befall them, rather than, what's going on now. Like, ostensibly she's a secretary, but, I don't know. Purely from a circumstantial perspective, a former aristocrat works at the place where something was stolen, and she makes the claim that people who lose their titles in such a way often resort to crime. If nothing else, that's sort of an, unwise thing to say. It's not that Saito and the others have the power to arrest her or anything. Not legally speaking anyways, but, well, now that I say that, maybe that's not true. Maybe, they have a sort of aristocratic privilege to do such a thing, should it come down to it. Now, unfortunately, it seems as though everyone's more interested on other things than actually finding the thief. Kirsch notably trying to pass off that fancy sword to Saito again. And, we still haven't really seen it in action, but, I think it really is a safe assumption that it's not going to be very impressive. The old rusty magical sword, despite looking real dingy and not all that sharp, it's probably going to be the better weapon in the long run. So everyone's just sort of playing their part here into investigating this little cabin in the woods. Saito scouted it out, Tabitha checked for traps using magic. Tellingly, all of the students are going inside while Miss Longville scouts around outside. I feel like if everyone was paying just a little bit more attention, they might keep, an eye on a suspicious figure like Miss Longville. Now, I'm sure they all know her. They all have something of a history with her insofar as anyone does with a teacher or, administrative staff, but, oh. Alright, well, I guess Tabitha's found it. So the Staff of Destruction was stashed in this cabin in the first place. Wow, one has to think that Saito and the others were remarkably unthorough. Unfortunately, though, this does seem to be a trap. Not a booby trap that Tabitha could have searched for, but a more practical trap. 4K has essentially wrangled them all into this house. And I suppose, if she wanted to get away cleanly, this would probably be the way to do it. Manufacture a search party and then just beat the brakes off of them, leaving no one the wiser. I mean, it makes sense from a certain perspective. Now, it is deeply unfortunate for Kirsch, Tabitha, and the others that none of their magic seems to be very effective on this golem, which, in a way, is sort of remarkable considering how the headmaster was talking so favorably of them. Now, unfortunately, this does leave a little gap for Louise to try her hand. Her spell seems to have made a mark on the golem, but only just enough to get its attention to her detriment. So the unfortunate thing is that Louise, despite her manifest lack of magical talent, is stubborn to an absolute fault, and that even in the face of a golem, on its way to, tread upon her or just squash her like a bug, she is unwilling to retreat. And while you do have to admire that sort of bravery, I really do think it is less bravery and more just plain stubborn foolhardiness. Now, I don't condone Saito here, but I certainly understand why that was his immediate impulse. I'm not sure if the backhand was the right approach per se, but at least it was an open hand, I guess. Now, for better or for worse, this seems to have essentially broken the dam here. Louise always tending towards being irritable, she's broken down into tears. It's like, look, if I run away, I will always be Louise the Zero. I need to do something. And, that's highly understandable. I can get behind that. I imagine anyone could, really. No one wants to be a loser forever, especially if that's all you've been your entire life. However, the thing Louise has not really internalized is that, she has a familiar for this sort of business, and sometimes you gotta rely on other people. Unfortunately, relying on other people cannot be said for Saito. He was relying on that nice golden sword, and it snapped immediately upon striking the golem. So, that's something. Saito just assumes that, okay, if I use the other sword, it'll break too, but that's not so. It doesn't really seem to have occurred to him that it's the sword that's not particularly well made, And, maybe that's not even strictly true. Maybe the sword is good enough in its own right, if a little too ostentatious for good taste, but the thing he hasn't really accounted for is that Derflinger is a magic sword, and that, maybe a magic sword is better suited to fighting a golem than a mundane sword. So even as Saito fights the golem with a fair degree of effectiveness, Louise is unwilling to just stand by and not get involved. And for better or for worse, she's decided to wield the Staff of Destruction. And this is where things get really interesting. It looks like no staff I've ever seen. And frankly, it looks like no staff any other wizard has ever used. That said, it does look like something else, As a matter of fact, it looks like a rocket launcher. The interesting thing is that Louise has no idea about that, but Saito almost instinctively knows how to use it, and, in a flash, just primes it and fires off a missile and destroys the golem. So this is something I really like, At this point in time, we only know that what had been called the Staff of Destruction is likely some sort of munition, but As for why it's here, who brought it here, and for what purpose, all of that is entirely ambiguous. Now, it is interesting that everyone just sort of assumes it's a magic relic. Kirsch marveling at Saito for having been able to wield the staff like that. But, Saito hasn't really had the chance to explain to everyone that, no, it's a mundane weapon from where I come from. So despite her golem having been defeated, Miss Longville's decided now's the time to make her presence known. She's picked up the staff, and, seeing how Saito operated it, she can no doubt use it too, but, that's all well and good, but she doesn't have the sort of foundational experience that someone like Saito would have. I imagine it's, it's kind of like, a phone or something like that. You know that a phone can do things, but you don't know that it would necessarily run out of battery. And in the same way, Miss Longville only knows of this as a magical weapon. She doesn't know that it requires ammunition, and that really there is only the one rocket. So Saito's just coming out with it. This is a weapon from my world, and I know it only has one rocket to it. So, this begs the question, if the rocket launcher has now been spent, then what use is the Staff of Destruction? Sure it is something the Academy has been tasked with keeping, but what's the point if it's no longer functional? I feel like Saito can't exactly explain that to everyone, at least not in a way that they would strictly understand. Now, this is something, after the successful completion of everything, everyone's being rewarded, but only the three aristocrats. Saito being a familiar and furthermore not an aristocrat, he's just sort of, he's an afterthought, really. And, if Louise were wise, she would reward him. Do something nice for the poor guy, considering everything that happened. Although, it seems like Saito's willing to forego a reward if he were to learn a little bit about the Staff of Destruction, particularly how it got here. Now, I suppose it kind of goes without saying that the headmaster here is the one who has the most information out of anyone. He claims it was a memento from someone he knew. And I guess case in point, according to the flashback, he was saved in his relative youth by a man who seems to be a soldier. So I guess the question is, if Saito was summoned here deliberately, and other people also come here from time to time, we can assume Saito's far from the first, and neither is this soldier here, then there must be some other mechanism for how people arrive in this world. And I guess more to the point, the interesting thing is that this was a soldier. He was dressed in fatigues, he was armed with what the headmaster describes as 2 staves of destruction, so one has to wonder, was this like a Vietnam War soldier or something? We know Saito's from quote-unquote modern day, with modern day being probably about 2012 or thereabout. Well, no, the Familiar Zero came out in 2006. Oh dear, I'm feeling very old indeed. But the salient point is, we don't know when that soldier was from initially. We have a rough idea. We can guess based on the level of technology, but I don't know. We don't know how time interacts with being transported to another world and all that. Now, this is interesting. We're sort of seeing through Saito's eyes, and indeed the eyes of everyone else, that Louise is actually kind of important here. Her arrival is heralded by, I guess someone with a microphone or something similar. And, people want to dance with her, which I was given to understand that no one really wanted to associate with Louise the Zero. But it seems as though her lineage, if nothing else, is somewhat attractive. However, despite all of that, she turns down everyone else for a dance and says, look, Saito, I will give you a dance. And as far as rewards go, it's not exactly the greatest thing, but, you gotta take it for what it's worth here. Like, I can scarcely imagine Louise would have done something like this in any earlier episode. And indeed, it's probably only the product of having recovered the Staff of Destruction and all that, So, against all odds, it seems like Louise and Saito have come to some degree of understanding. They're talking to each other cordially. Louise says she believes him about all that business from being from another world, and I guess when you get down to it, seeing Saito operate the quote-unquote Staff of Destruction like that, I feel like that lends a fair bit of credence to anything he says. Now, unfortunately, things are still a little bit melancholy. Saito makes it clear he does want to return home, which, it's kind of a sad thing. Louise, without a familiar, she would be, decidedly lower class than she is now, and I feel like against all odds she does kind of like the guy a slight tiny bit, if only because he did go out of his way to save her life. Now this is somewhat telling. The sword, who has presumably been owned by many such familiars as Saito, remarks that he's never seen anyone dance with his master like that, which, I guess that sort of indicates a special relationship forming between Saito and Louise. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.